Up until now we have concentrated on the ideological, political and military contradictions in the revolutionary process and their interaction with international conflicts. But the picture wouldn't be complete without the inclusion of another factor, the long history of Russia. The approaching catastrophe was noticed by observers from a broad range of political orientations, well before 1917 and even before the founding of the Bolshevik Party. In 1811, in a St. Petersburg still shaken by the peasant revolt led by Pugachev that was crushed a few decades earlier at great difficulty, Joseph de Maistre expresses his concern that a new European kind of revolution could break out, led this time by an intellectual class of popular origin or sentiment, by a university-educated Pugachev. By comparison, the disorder witnessed in France would be child's play. There's no words to express what I fear could come to pass. 308 Let's skip ahead by half a century. An even more accurate prediction, and quite admirable for its foresight, can be read in an article on Russia by Marx published in an American newspaper, the New York Daily Tribune, January 17, 1859. If the nobility continues to oppose the emancipation of the peasantry, a grand revolution will break out, and from it will arise a reign of terror by these half-Asiatic serfs, unequaled in history. 309 Soon after the revolution of 1905, it's the Prime Minister himself, Sergei Witte, who stresses that the current situation in Russia was unsustainable and warns the Tsar of the danger represented by the Bund, the peasant revolt. Quote, "One cannot halt the forward march of humanity. If it doesn't triumph through reform, the idea of human freedom will triumph by means of revolution. But in the latter case, it'll be born from the ashes of 1,000 years of calamities. The Russian Bund, blind and unforgiving, will destroy all in its wake, it will reduce everything to ash. The horrors of the Russian Bund will surpass all those known in history." Unquote. 310 Moreover, it's Witte himself who is involved in the ferocious repression that's used to confront the revolution of 1905 and the often brutal jackeries who take part in it. The Interior Minister, P. Andernovo, orders the governors to immediately proceed to the execution of the rebels, and to burn and level the villages where the disturbances originate from. It's followed by military courts, collective punishment, death squads, and pogroms against Jews, blamed as the source of subversion. It's a situation that continues on until the start of the First World War. It's precisely the Interior Minister who warns, the revolution in its most extreme form, and an irreversible state of anarchy, will be the only predictable outcome of an unfortunate conflict with the Kaiser. 311 It's what will happen soon enough. Let's look at Russia's situation on the eve of the Bolsheviks' rise to power. Soon shaken is the myth of a country that, after the overthrow of autocracy, would happily proceed in the direction of liberalism and democracy. It's a myth encouraged by Churchill who, to justify his interventionist policy, accuses the Bolsheviks, sustained by German gold, of having violently overthrown the Russian Republic and the Russian Parliament. 312 It would be easy to accuse the British statesman of hypocrisy. He knew very well that between February and October London had continually supported coup attempts that sought to restore the Tsarist autocracy or impose a military dictatorship. It's Kerensky himself who points out that the governments of France and Britain took advantage of every opportunity to sabotage the provisional government of Russia. 313 However, from his exile in the United States, the Menshevik leader never gives up cultivating this myth in question, accusing the Bolsheviks of a double treason, against the homeland and against the recently born Russian democracy. 314 If the accusation of treason to the nation becomes obsolete with the end of the Second World War and the rise of the USSR as a superpower, Kerensky was one of the few defeated Menshevik leaders who clung to it. Still today the topic of the Bolsheviks' betrayal of democracy is commonplace, a betrayal that culminates in the Stalinist terror. But that general line of thinking doesn't stand up to historical analysis. It's not just a matter of the obstinacy of the leaders who rose out of the February days of the revolution, Determined to remain in a bloodbath that the great majority of the people are determined to end, it's a political line that can only be carried forth by resorting to terror and an iron-fist discipline on the front lines and in the rear. And not even the repeated attempts to install a military dictatorship constitute the principal aspect. There's much more. The idea that the February Revolution had been a bloodless revolution and that mass violence had only broken out with the October Revolution was a liberal myth. It's one of the most stubborn myths around 1917, but has now lost all credibility. 315 Let's examine the real timeline of events. The rebels took terrible revenge on the officials of the old regime. There was a hunt for police officers in order to lynch and kill them without mercy. 316 In St. Petersburg, after a few days the death toll reached around 1,500, with the ferocious lynching of the most hated representatives of the old regime. The worst violence was to be committed by the Kronstadt sailors, who mutilated and killed hundreds of officers. 317 Those who mutinied were the younger recruits. The standard disciplinary norms didn't apply to them, and the officers took advantage of this to treat them with a brutality even more sadistic than usual, and now they have unleashed a vengeance of unprecedented ferocity. 318 Things worsened later in September, after the attempted coup d'état by General Kornilov. Executions and assassinations by crowds break out and are accompanied by unprecedented violence. The officers were tortured and mutilated before being killed, eyes and tongues ripped out, ears cut, nails driven into shoulders, in the place of epaulettes, hung upside down, impaled. According to General Brusilov, a large number of young officers killed themselves to escape a horrible death. 319 Further, the methods of killing their superiors were so brutal, that no one could really condemn such a suicide. 320 Moreover, the rage already made itself felt before October, and in the resolutions by the Soviets, then in large part dominated by the socialist revolutionaries, they branded as enemies of the people the bloodthirsty capitalists, the bourgeoisie who drink the blood of the people. 321 On the other hand, the crisis in commerce between the city and the countryside, well before the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks, caused a new round of intense violence. In the tragic situation that had arisen after the catastrophe of the war, with the fall in agricultural production and the hoarding of what scarce food is available, the survival of urban residents depends on quite drastic measures. Even before the October Revolution, a government minister, despite being a prominent liberal economist, argues in favor of requisition by force of arms should market incentives fail. The fact is that the practice of requisition is common to all parties during war. 322 The combination of these multiple contradictions causes a bloody state of anarchy with the collapse of all authority and all administrative organization, with an explosion of savage violence coming from below, and with a militarization and an overall brutalization of social behavior and political practices. 323 It's a brutalization without possible means of comparison to that known in Western societies. 324. To understand this tragedy, it's necessary to keep in mind the way in which social violence spreads. Beginning in the areas where military violence takes place, the rear is engulfed in the violence by peasant army deserters outside the confines of the military, by the millions of deserters from the crumbling Russian army, by the fact that the distinctions between the front and rear, between the civilian and military sphere, become increasingly narrow. In conclusion, the violence from the military zone spreads everywhere in society as a whole, not only falls into chaos and anarchy, but becomes hostage to an unprecedented brutalization. 325 Therefore, it's a question that begins with the First World War and the crisis and breakdown of the Russian army. Perhaps it would even be better to go even further back. The exceptional level of violence that strikes 20th-century Russia is explained by shedding light on the two interlinked processes, the Grand Jacquerie of October 1917 that had been gathering force for centuries, and precisely for that reason unleashes a wave of blind and indiscriminate violence against the landowners, against their property, their homes, and their very lives. In addition to this, there's powerful resentment toward the city itself. The second process is the collapse of the Tsarist military, the most numerous army in history, 95% of whom were peasants. 326. The oppression, exploitation and humiliation of an immense mass of peasantry by an exclusive, aristocratic elite, who considered themselves foreign in relation to their own people, considered a different and inferior race, were precursors to a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Especially because the social conflict became even more acute with the outbreak of World War I, in which the noble officers on a daily basis exercised a true power of life and death over peasant soldiers. It's no coincidence that at the first signs of crisis they sought to maintain discipline on the front and in the rear by resorting to the use of artillery. 327 The collapse of the old regime is the moment for revenge and vengeance, cultivated and sown over centuries. The Prince G.E. Lvov self-critically recognizes this. The vengeance of the peasant servants was a settling of accounts with those who for centuries had refused to treat the peasants as people, rather than as dogs. 328 Unfortunately, precisely because it was a matter of vengeance, it took on forms not only brutal, but also purely destructive. Thousands of drunk workers and soldiers wandered through the cities, looting warehouses and shops, breaking into homes, beating and robbing peasants. Still worse is what would happen in the countryside. Near the front, large groups of deserters wandered through the countryside and engaged in banditry. The combined agitation of the disbanded soldiers and peasantry provokes throughout Russia a devastating fire, not only similar to the Jacquerie, but to Luddism as well. Agrarian machinery was destroyed, machinery that in previous years reduced the need for wage labor, and included vandalism. Indeed, the peasantry destroyed noble homes, churches and schools. They set libraries and priceless works of art aflame. 329.